All right. Good morning. December is here. It's the end of the year. I'm Katie at the Lighting Design Lab. If you've taken a webinar with us in the past uh, few months, you know that I have kind of a busy, noisy background. Apologize, we are working on a solution for that. You have made it to the first CPACER discussion that we've had. Thank you, Seth, for setting this up. And we're going to talk about this financing option with Terry Sullivan from King County and Rachael Brombaugh from Washington, formerly from King County, but now with PACE Equity. And then later, Seth's going to lead both of them and our special guest, David McCaughey, in a panel discussion. So a little bit of information, a little bit of discussion. It should be a great hour and a half with us here. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't taken a webinar with us before, you're all going to be on mute, but we do have a questions box over in your GoToWebinar menu. If you don't see the menu, which happens sometimes, GoTo minimizes it for some reason. Look for a little flashing red arrow on one of your screens and click that, and it'll slide back out. We're recording this, so excuse me, if you have to step out or if you want to share this afterwards with colleagues, this will be posted on our website within about a week. If it's not up in a week and you really need it, ping me. I'm responsible for that. And there's a little poll, a little survey after class to give us some feedback. We love the feedback that we get from you guys. This is the last class for the year from us. We do in January have another first. We're going to do a webinar on Manual J and Manual S, so for sizing residential HVAC equipment. That should be very interesting as well. And there's our website, and there's a link to our newsletter. When you get the slides, you can click on that. And with that, we will let Terry do his thing. I'll go on mute so it's quiet, and take it away, Terry.
Thanks, Katie and Seth, for setting this up. Appreciate being here today to share a little bit about King County's CPACER program. I'm Terry Sullivan. I work in King County's Executive Climate Office. I work on climate policy broadly, but skew a little bit towards building decarbonization work, and as part of that, oversee the CPACER program, our newest program. We've been launched last year, and so have about 2 years under our belt, and can talk a little bit about that moving forward. So I'll start with a little bit of context, if I can get the slides to move.
It took me 2 clicks last time, Terry.
All right.
FYI.
Keep clicking away. So starting with a little bit of context, the main driving force behind why we have a CPACER program in King County and others across the country do as well is to drive greater energy efficiency and emissions reductions, and here in Washington State, greater resilience in our buildings. In King County, as of 2019, about half of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the building sector, and trades off with transportation as the sort of biggest chunk of our emissions across the county. And so our CPACER program is one of the main things that we can do directly as a county to enable these projects and to reduce emissions across commercial, multifamily, even industrial buildings. So that's kind of our background of why we have this program and why we're trying to scale it up. Moving on to a little bit more about CPACER basics. For those of you who don't know, probably most of you do if you're here, CPACER stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy, and in Washington State, we added the R for resilience. These programs have grown a ton over the past 10 to 15 years across the country. I think there's now 34 or 35 different states that have CPACE legislation enabled in their state, so counties and cities can run programs or statewide programs in some instances. Here in Washington State, we passed a bill in 2020 to enable the policies, and in 2022 updated that to do some technical fixes. And so many places across Washington State now have programs stood up and over the last year or so. But what is CPACE, if you're not real familiar with it? Generally, it's a financing mechanism for energy efficiency or renewable energy projects. It's a loan, so it really allows the building owner to install equipment that's permanently affixed to the property. So think about mechanical equipment or other permanent improvements. And the differences between a PACE loan typically and a typical loan are that the lien is attached to the property and not the borrower. So that's sort of one of the main drivers and appeal. PACE loans typically have a longer loan term than a conventional loan, so allow for lower capital outlays every month and smaller upfront capital requirements. Often PACE loans do not have upfront costs, so are easier and more accessible for more buildings. Just to clarify, loan terms are not negotiated. King County gets to stay out of that. I don't have to play a role in that. That's negotiated between the lender and the borrower. So you can talk to Rachael more about that. County's role is limited to kind of setting up the program, recording the lien, making sure that folks are aware of the program, and then trying to find ways to break down barriers so that more folks use this program. But just to highlight and recap, the benefits of PACE are lower payments typically, improving cash flow, and then longer loan terms, and that can allow for different types of projects that are sometimes not don't have a payback. So longer or deeper energy retrofits, longer payback measures. And those kind of goals or those values of kind of driving towards emissions reductions and the kind of basic PACE construct has informed a little bit of how we made some tweaks to how our program works compared to how other programs across the country work. So one main thing there is that we do not allow PACE lending to be used for fossil fuel equipment. So that's an important thing to remember. Although, a lot of places in Washington State and Seattle in particular, that's not going to happen because of our great energy codes now, but still we can't use PACE financing here to install fossil fuel infrastructure. Other than that, we allow most of the same types of qualified improvements to be installed as other PACE programs across the country. One thing I mentioned, the R stands for resilience. So we in Washington State do have a wide range of projects that we allow to improve resilience of buildings. So that can include seismic retrofits, and it can include, in certain situations, microgrid projects or stormwater management. And so that's we have a little bit of flexibility there and still kind of figuring out what that exactly means, but a lot of potentially interesting projects to improve our older buildings. We do specifically call out EV charging infrastructure as an allowable cost. And so that kind of summary there on the left of the kind of range of different projects you can see in either new construction or in retrofit projects: energy efficiency, electrification projects, solar installations, all kinds of really good stuff. And a couple more examples here. We've now had our project or our program up and running for 2 years and kind of seen a nice range of new construction projects and retrofit projects. We've seen lots of water efficiency, some envelope upgrades, some space and water heating electrification. Not much in the resilient space just yet, but you starting to get a lot of questions about seismic retrofits and URMs and water management. So really a ton of different types of projects qualify. Couple more basics, just so we understand the basic rules here. Eligible properties are really going to be almost any building in King County that's not a small residential building or not a publicly owned building. So multifamily buildings of 5 or more units, any commercial, agricultural, industrial buildings, new construction projects, as I mentioned, or retrofits. And there's I mentioned a lot of the different kinds of projects that you can use CPACE on. So that's going to be for the materials and labor for all those different great projects, but also worth noting that a lot of different fees can be covered by CPACE financing, and so that can help enable more projects to happen. The improvements, whatever they are, do need to be certified by someone with accreditation, so PE or CEM or other, a list of the certifications we allow on our site, but there is a process we go through to ensure that the qualified improvements are in fact eligible. But as you heard earlier, there's quite a lot of flexibility as long as you're reducing emissions, reducing energy use, and new construction projects, exceeding the energy code. And then, yeah, on the right there, you can see we have a look back policy, which is just another way of saying think of a refinancing mechanism so that projects completed in the past 3 years can also leverage this new program. To date, we are still a new program and coming into this market in a little bit of a tough situation. So there hasn't been a ton of projects just yet, coming out of COVID and with high interest rates and kind of a transition period here at the county. But we do have 6 projects that have come through the program to date, totaling $80 million in financing. This one early on in the program was this picture you see here, the beautiful historic lodge at St. Edward Park in Kenmore. It's a really cool building. It's a big retrofit project, and they used, I think, $19 or $20 million in PACE financing to cover, I think, some heat pumps, install some new plumbing fixtures, some envelope upgrades, and a couple other things. So it's a really cool project. We've also had a couple of new multifamily buildings come into the program recently. So hopefully starting to see a little bit more activity as we come out of this market environment. And CPACE is a great enabling mechanism for lots of potential projects, but the main driver for a lot of this activity, hopefully in the coming years, will be the Clean Building Performance Standard, and hopefully here in the next week, the Seattle's BEPS, the Building Emissions Performance Standard. Buildings will need to comply, and there's probably a lot more people here can speak to the nuances and details of the Clean Building Standard better than I can, but as many of you know, the first compliance period starts in 2026, and so pretty much any building that's going to have to comply and do some work to reduce their EUI can leverage the CPACE program, as long as we're not just talking about O&M and energy management. So as long as it's a fix to the property and doing something to reduce your EUI, it's probably a good candidate to at least think about CPACE lending and to go talk to one of your lenders. You can pair, I think we'll talk a little bit about this later, but you can pair CPACE loans with incentives, with utility incentives, with early adopter incentives from Commerce and many other tools to make these projects happen. So just to wrap up here so we can get on to the main discussion, we have a ton of resources on our website. You can see the URL there to direct you to those resources. We've got a program guide that can kind of cover everything I've just run through in detail. So if you want to know a little bit more about the qualified projects or qualified improvements and how to run through the process, you can see our application materials and get a sense that it's not too daunting of a program to navigate. We also have some helpful handouts if you want to spread the word and help drive higher awareness of this program across the region. And then we have a help desk. So we typically get people coming through the help desk either really early on, just trying to understand the basics of CPACE, or kind of late in the game when they've identified a lender and or have a project that they're looking to kind of wrap up and bring through the program. So we'll be there to answer any questions you have along the way, and hopefully get more of these projects through the program and completed in the coming years. That's my quick run, and can pass it to Seth or Rachel to keep us moving.
Great, well, I'll take over from here. Thank you so much, Terry, for putting together that overview of King County's, looks like our screen popped. Katie, can you put it back to?
Yeah, I don't know what happened here. Let's start it over.
Anyway, want to thank the Lighting Design Lab for inviting me and Seth, and really appreciate it. So here we go. Let's see. Looks like slide 16.
Yeah,
there we go.
There we go. Huh. Okay. We'll hope that doesn't happen again.
That's okay. Thanks everybody for your patience. Just so I want to talk a little bit about PACE equity and what we do and how we fit into PACE. There we go. Just I'm Rachael Brombaugh. I'm the managing director for Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Alaska. Some big states with some good programs. A little bit about PACE equity. So I've been in this market for a long time. I probably know a bunch of you that are listening in. And PACE Equity, you probably have not heard so much about. We're headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Since about 2014, have been funding PACE projects throughout the country. We've funded over 200 projects and over $400 million since 2014 as part of, over $2.5 billion, so about $2.7 billion of commercial development. We work really hard to make sure that we are doing the right thing with our money. And so we are very conscious about our carbon emissions and the impact that we have, both on sustainability, economic development, and just community development. We do measure our carbon emissions reductions through our investments, and at this point it's over 1 million metric tons. And part of how we're accelerating that is through our Cirrus Low Carbon program, which offers lower rates for lower carbon buildings. So I'll share a little bit more about that in some case studies that we'll go through in a minute. Okay. Just a quick overview, and from this slide you can tell that I am not a graphic designer. I am a lender and policy person. Just want to show how things work together, right? So Terry just talked about the public program, right? King County and other jurisdictions throughout the country set up the program with the rules and administer it. We at PACE Equity, we are the private capital that comes into the picture. We provide the funding for the building owner to make improvements to his or her building or to build a new building, right? And thankfully we have service providers like David on here who are also part of the puzzle that are performing the work that needs to be done. So just a quick overview just to explain, just because it's not the easiest program to understand. How we look at it here, and this is a kind of a capital stack of a building that can be used both for new construction and for retrofits, right? On the left, you've got, when you want to, let's say, build a building, you have a certain amount of debt, and then you have a certain amount of equity or secondary debt that you need to put on there. Where we can come in, and this is both for, again, for new construction and retrofits, we can come in, we can look at all those elements that are part of the energy efficiency or renewable or resiliency components, as Terry mentioned for the Lodge St. Edward's Park, the HVAC, the electrical, the plumbing, and we can fund up to 30% of the value of the property for all of those items. So then really reducing the amount of cash outlay that a building owner would need to put out. So in the case of a retrofit to comply with the Clean Buildings Act or Seattle's building emission performance standards, if somebody has a project that's a $2 million project and their building is worth more than $10 million, we're in great shape. We could fund, assuming the cash flows there, we could fund all of that out of pocket, including fees. So I want to just go over a couple case studies here, just showing actual projects that we've closed recently. This is a office redevelopment actually in San Antonio. You see from the nice drawing there, or the watercolors, this beautiful, terracotta and brick building. We were part of the overall funding for this, and we used our Cirrus Low Carbon. That's the fund that I talked about earlier. What Cirrus is it is aligning sustainability with economic goals. So when a customer, when a builder or developer meets the design specifications for our Cirrus Low Carbon program, they get really two benefits. They get a much lower rate on their PACE assessment, anywhere from 0.5 to 0.75 percentage point lower, and they get a marketing package that they can put up to attract and retain tenants. So it's a plaque. We work with them on materials to talk about how great and low carbon the building is, and we also they get listed on the New Buildings Institute Getting to Zero site. So it's a really great benefit that we found. What we found also is that a lot of developers, even if they're not sustainability minded, they really like the lower interest rate. And they're like, oh, sure, sign me up. So in this case, for the Allen redevelopment, we came in and we financed some high performance. Whoa, somebody's moving ahead. I got it. Thanks. Some high performance windows, some insulation, some rooftop units, and some LED lighting. And because they were able to meet our spec, which is similar to Washington's energy code, it's pretty much ASHRAE 2019 plus about 5%. They were able to not only preserve $1.6 million of capital, that was capital that the owners did not have to put into the project because they were able to fund with PACE equity, and even at a lower rate, giving them additional benefits of $355,000. So that's one example for a bigger project. Move on to the next project here. We were able to put some rooftop and ground mount solar on an office building in Euclid, Ohio. And the cost of that project was, again, coincidentally, $1.6 million. In this case, we were able to fund all of it so that the building owner had zero cash out of pocket. In this case, the building owner is actually then selling the solar back to their tenants, thereby actually generating a revenue stream that can help pay for the assessment. So another great use of funding. This was also serious low carbon. Renewables qualify automatically for the lower interest rate. Then I want to talk a little bit about resiliency. I don't have a name here or a picture because this is a project I'm actively working on here in Seattle. Some building owners of a really nice old unreinforced masonry building in Capitol Hill reached out looking to do some reinforcement, some seismic reinforcement on their property. So we're looking at that. That's something that we can fund, obviously under King County's program. And this is another case where, because of the structure of PACE, it's an assessment on the property, the building owner will be able to pass the costs of the project on to their tenants through some of their CAM charges. So that's another great example of the use of PACE. And all of the cost plus any fees, again, would be all funded by PACE equity. So no costs, no out-of-pocket costs for the building owner. One more here on industrial. This was in Wisconsin. This was a great project. A couple of years back, we were able to fund this little bump out expansion and some improvements in their packaging and their HVAC, letting them be a lot more efficient. I wish we had put a whole bunch of solar on the roof. That would be, maybe that's phase 2. And again, totally out of, we were able to fund 100%. So that was $1.4 million that they were able to put into growing their business, not growing their facility. So again, a great story there. And then one last, I just wanted to show an example of new construction. This was down in Miami, Florida. I'm just trying to show you the breadth of what PACE equity can fund. This was new multifamily in Miami. We came in and we're about 20% of the capital stack. I think this was a $25 million project. They had owner's equity, they had senior debt, and then they had PACE funding on there. So really allowing them to retain control and lower their cost of capital as they built. Because as Terry mentioned, and I've seen in the market, it's a challenging time for a lot of building owners right now with high interest rates and high capital or high construction costs. So, the really most important thing to remember is my phone number and email address if you have any questions. And thanks for listening. I look forward to the panel discussion, and I'll hand it the controls back to you, Katie.
And excuse me, with that, I will hand it over to Seth to lead a panel discussion.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Terry and Rachel, for the presentations. We'll transition now to the second segment here, the panel discussion. This is where we'll make it real, bring the concepts that we've heard already today about, bring it to life, and we'll do that through a series of questions that I'll be asking our panelists. Just a quick introduction of myself. I'm Seth McKinney. I'm the Decarbonization Manager at Ecotope, where I focus on program and policy development related to decarbonization, with a primarily focused on emerging technology deployment and utility programs. I'm also focused on zero carbon planning and implementation for existing buildings and portfolios. I'm also the in-house expert around building performance standards, so all related to the work we're talking about here. I'm hoping we can have a really good discussion. So joining Terry and Rachel on the panel is David McCaughey from UMC. David has a broad vision for how CPACER can be applied to a range of building solutions. So looking forward to the discussion. I'll be the moderator, and just encourage the audience to continue to add your questions to the chat and actively listen and prepare any questions you might have. There will be a Q&A segment following the discussion. So let's get into it. So first, Rachel, this all sounds great. How does somebody actually get started to do one of these projects?
Yeah, thanks. So the first thing to do is to call me, right? And shameless plug there. But I'll just tell you a little bit about how we look at a project when somebody calls us. So what I want to see is a construction budget, and I want to see a pro forma or actual operating results for the building. And so we go over the construction budget with the customer, and I pull out those items that we could fund that would comply with the county's program. So let's say they're going to put in $1 million of upgraded HVAC. They want to put in electric vehicle charging. They want to put in new high performance windows. Great, we can look at all of that. And let's say the total comes up to 1.5 million. I'm just going to make up numbers here, right? So then that's how we size it, and then we need to look at, can the cash flows support that, and what is it on a loan to value basis, right? So we need to make sure that the 1.5 million plus the fees and any capitalized interest in there is less than 30% of the value of the building. I think in most cases that's pretty easy to hit. Then we need to just make sure that the cash flow for the building, not necessarily the energy savings alone. It's not like performance contracting. You don't have to match that dollar for dollar. So we want to make sure that the cash flow from the tenants, the rents from the building will cover both the PACE equity assessment and any other debt that's on the property. So we look at those combined and make sure that fits. So that looks good. Then we move forward with term sheets. We want to have conversations with the other lender to make sure they're okay with it and going to provide consent, and then we move towards a closing process. I've made it pretty simple, but at a high level, that's how it works.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I appreciate the overview there. I mean, it sounds like you said, you made it pretty simple, but there are several steps in there that certainly have a lot of consideration. So what types of projects would be ideal candidates for funding? And in other words, like what are the factors that drive these projects, such as policy mandates or resiliency needs? I know Terry touched on some of those, you've touched on some of those, but what are you really seeing in the market?
Yeah, and I'll invite my colleagues to jump in too. But any commercial building really is qualified. Terry laid out it's office, industrial, hospitality, senior living, and any multifamily over 5 units. So it's very broad. It's very applicable. And one thing I like about that is that it's not just the big sophisticated building owners and developers can use CPACER. Anybody can, and I have lots of conversations with kind of the smaller regional developers who are really interested in CPACER, because those are the developers that have to go out and get a lot of external equity and investment in their project. But you know, I'm seeing folks. They're in new development. I'll just say it's mostly multifamily. I'm not seeing a lot of new office development, so mostly multifamily. A lot of industrial is still very active. And then in the existing built environment, I'm seeing more interest in PACE equity, not only because of the compliance factor. I think something I think we can talk about a little bit more. I think people are really starting to become more aware that they need to be acting now in order to be prepared to meet the 2026 compliance deadlines. People are really, and I think there's a lot of folks that are, putting that message out there, and the building owners and managers, I think, are really finally starting to understand that and work towards it. So, that, with the State Clean Buildings Act, I think there's a lot of interest in how buildings are going to meet Seattle's standards, but I'm also seeing property owners, especially in a really competitive environment, that are looking to improve their buildings in order to attract and retain tenants. It's a very competitive market out there, particularly in office, to keep tenants. And so if you've got, a nice building with nice tenant improvements, but also you can say, hey, we've got really clean air, we've got, really good systems that'll make it really comfortable in our facility. That's definitely what folks are looking at too.
That's great. And David, I'm going to pose the same question to you. What are you seeing in the market when you're out talking to folks looking to potentially start a project or finance a project?
I think it always comes down to financing, and it always seems as though, depending on what the mission of the organization is, what they really do, as opposed to the envelope they do it within, it's more difficult to find those capital dollars. And so often it helps ease the discussion that there are other pathways to this and not quite as linear maybe as before. So it's one tool, I guess, to use to kind of open people up to either wanting to do the right thing if they're an owner occupier, or if, as Rachel said, attract and retain tenants in a very competitive market. So I think it's a wonderful tool, and I talk about it a lot.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I appreciate it. Yeah. So, given the policy mandates, the resiliency needs, we heard Rachel's working on some seismic reinforcements in Capitol Hill around reinforced masonry. The city's full of those buildings. The state's full of those buildings. It seems like there's a need to be able to finance not only these projects for compliance, ESG and sustainability goals, but also these resiliency projects. But there's also some significant barriers around financing and other barriers, just perhaps around just knowledge dissemination, like what we're doing here. Are some of those barriers more transient than others, or are some of them more sticky? And maybe I'll start with Terry on that question, just to get the government perspective.
We're always trying to break down barriers here.
Yeah.
And I think, David and Rachael showed her nice puzzle graphic earlier. Like most of the time I'm hearing about these things or coming to these things after a lot of work's already been done between lenders and project teams. So I probably get like slightly different perspective on barriers. But I think given that this program is pretty new to our state, to our region, and Rachael can speak to this, we've talked about this a lot, there's very, very low awareness of CPACER, no matter how much David talks about it and Rachael talks about it, but there's still a lot of work to be done to just break down the basic barrier of people knowing about these things, and that translates a lot to what we typically see in these big regulatory policies like the Clean Buildings Act or the BEPS or previously Seattle's tune-up program, but typically people don't act on these things until they really have to, for the most part. So we are doing as much as we can to try and get the word out and just break down that initial awareness barrier. Another thing we hear a lot about from building owners who are reaching out to us early on and just saying, hey, give me the really basic information on this program, is that they want to know who to go to talk to next. So connecting building owners to lenders is kind of something we'll be working on in 2024. I typically can't recommend one lender over the other as a government entity, but we are trying to work through a process where we can get a bunch of smaller lenders who can do smaller projects in the region and get these national lenders like PACE Equity and get them all run through an RFQ process and their information online, so people can more quickly find Rachael and her colleagues across the country and get started on some of these projects. So we're trying to break down those barriers and hope that the market kind of gets to a better place so that more of these smaller energy and emissions focused projects are happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. David or Rachael, any other thoughts on some of the barriers that are more transient, I guess beyond hopefully the interest rate aspect? Although I did hear recently that we may not see any relief in that until 2030, but we'll see. Around things that are more sticky versus more transient in terms of barriers to these to more of these projects.
Well, I'll jump in. I think the interest rate question is it's the elephant in the room. And if I knew what interest rates were, what direction they were going, I would be in my cabin skiing instead of talking with you. Although I'm having a fantastic time doing this. What we're also seeing is construction costs are really high right now. It's really been somewhat of a perfect storm in a lot of ways for developers and building owners. Interest rates are high, construction and materials costs are high. We've had supply chain issues that really kind of set some projects in knots. I think there's also some awareness that our permitting process is very slow and could be faster. I hear a lot of that, particularly in the housing arena, where we in the region need tens of thousands of more units of housing, and it's just it's hard to get that done quickly, and the permitting cycle is very thorough for a reason, but I think there could be opportunities to accelerate that process in order to help get some projects built and really kind of alleviate that backlog, particularly on the housing side.
David, I'm going to ask you a similar question. You're a little bit closer to the developer, to the building owner a lot of times. A lot of times selling the project itself and then bringing in financing potentially. What's your assessment of this in terms of awareness, barriers, facilitation, materials? The resources available to you to get this out in the world.
That's all valid. I think the supply chain, depending on which part of the supply chain, right, we're talking about like new construction, seems to be rectifying itself, but you never know. And you're correct. I mean, any estimates that we give, some of our vendors or subs will give us 7 days of dating on the price. So subject to change in 1 week, but here's the price of all the conduit or all the equipment that you want, or here's the lead time on a roof unit today, but that could go up a couple of weeks next week. I think the other thing that should be driving people to look more toward this, and yes, higher interest rates and everything else, but this is a mechanism that actually hedges that, are these mandates that many building owners have been putting, hoping that they will go away, or that someone will legislate or litigiously make them go away. I think the last session was pretty clear that was initiated by a small group of people, but it died very quickly. And so this really is happening. And to say 2026 being the first year, which you need 12 months, sorry, of energy data to prove that you are in compliance, really means that 2026 is really 2025, which now is a year away.
Yeah, and you're referring to the first deadline to the Clean Buildings Performance Standard for the largest buildings, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, just if a project was on fire, that was going to significantly say if you were saving, 15 to 25 to 30% of a building's energy use, is through permitting, et cetera, Rachel, would maybe get finished on time, but it would have to start immediately. And that's difficult. So I think the timing of this panel and just to be able to disseminate it is really good because the window of opportunity is closing. And those fines are going to be real. And why pay a fine when you could take that same capital and apply it to, benefit for decades to come today?
Yeah, and I think we're sort of touching on this here and there, but how can more projects be facilitated through PACER or just more projects in general to encourage compliance, reduce emissions, improve energy efficiency? So on the topic of incentives beyond the benefits that PACER can bring, I'll start with you again, Rachel. How are building owners currently leveraging sort of the combination between third-party financing like PACER, or I guess I should say CPACER, investment tax credits, 179D, the things that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act, utility incentives, et cetera, grants, those things. How's that value stack actually stacking up in the market?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of really complex deals that have, PACE equity funding, new markets tax credits, tax increment financing, and so we're really comfortable in that layer. And I mean, these days it is definitely a multi-layer cake, right? You can try to get funding wherever you can, and there's a lot of options. I think there's you have to be able to navigate it too, right? Like just to find out like what are the state, what are the federal, how is that stuff coming down? But the good news is that we can work within that, right? There's nothing that gets in the way of some sort of cash grant in lieu or some sort of deduction that comes down the way. CPACER is generally a long tenor product, right? Our terms, our assessment terms go out to the life of the equipment. So it could be 25 or 30-year terms. That's fully amortizing, right? But you can prepay, and you can prepay a portion of it. You can prepay all of it. So it's got that flexibility in there to work with the customer's cash flow. So I mean, that's one thing I really like about it is that it's able to jump in, provide the capital when needed, and then stay on if that's what works, or get refinanced out in a couple of years if that's better for the project, for the cash flow, for the building.
Yeah, so just let me translate there if I got it right. So the ability to finance the project and then get the utility incentive later, or the deduction later, or the investment tax credit later, and then buy down the capital, essentially prepaying. You have that flexibility to do that.
Yeah.
That's I mean, that's potentially huge. Yeah.
The utilities are very motivated right now to show load reductions. And so some of the pay for performance programs that exist, it literally is just a cash flow thing. It's, pay today, show the implementation and the commissioning of the equipment, and you can have, at least 50% of that incentive almost instantly. So it is just a matter of like a bridge financing, and Rachel sounds like she's very flexible in analyzing all that and saying, yes, it is certain because the year is being set and the savings will be seen. So it's just a matter of cash flow.
Yeah, so showing lower monthly payments to improve feasibility. And you're saying, David, that would be interesting to your potential clients or current clients, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think the confidence, they need confidence. And as new as this concept is in the state of Washington, it really, and you had said this, Terry, at the onset, it's available in 35 states and the District of Columbia. And it's been around for decades in North America. And I think as much as I say that, I think the peer-to-peer exchanges maybe with some of those other PACE clients would be probably an excellent way to introduce people to real life experience from building owners from other states and how that has really gone for them. I mean, Rachel, your case studies are excellent. There's other case studies out there, but I do believe in just getting literally a peer together with another and saying, let's talk. Let's talk through it. Happy to facilitate that.
Yeah, I'm just taking a note here on that. I often hear that one of the key values of CPACER is quote unquote taking it off the balance sheet. And I'll be honest, I find myself struggling to answer the question. It's like, well, I know that that's the case, and sort of in my mind, I can see the spreadsheet and how that works, but I personally have a hard time explaining why that's a benefit. Or I understand why it's a benefit, but it seems like there's a little bit more nuance here when it comes to CPACER. So wondering, maybe again, starting with Rachel on that one.
Yeah, and Terry, I'll ask Terry to jump in too, because he, that's actually the role of the county is to record the lien. So another way that CPACER is different than a conventional loan, right? I mean, so I already talked about, we have really long amortizations. A bank usually, it might have a long amortization, but it might it might mature in 10 years or have a reprice in 10 years. Our loans are fixed for 25 or 30 years. So that's really important. The other thing, referencing what Seth said, is that because we put a lien on the property that's akin to property taxes. So it's not on the title. So if, for example, Seth, you were to have a PACE equity deal to improve your building, if we were to have problems, we would not have recourse to you. We would have recourse to the building and to the equipment. So it's called, in lending terms, it's called non-recourse because it's tied to the building, tied to the equipment, not to the person owning the building. So there's kind of just an odd nuance there that a lot of building owners they don't want to have more obligations than absolutely necessary. So that's our nuance on it. I don't know if Terry has anything to add on how you look at it when recording.
I mean, not much. Just reiterate that really lowers your risk. And by we do see almost all of our applications in the 25 to 30 year range, and so talking about really long terms on these projects, and that makes it a lot more appealing.
Yeah, and I guess circling back to the core of the question, which is quote unquote taking it off the balance sheet. I'm wondering if is that an accurate way of describing what's happening, or is it more of a shifting it to a different part of how it's accounted that is not necessarily on the balance sheet, not necessarily in the capital either?
Well, I think it's like, whose balance sheet are you looking at, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Right. If you're looking at the builder, the owner, or the developer itself, it's tied to the building, not to that. But if it all flows up, it will eventually all flow up. When I think of off balance sheet, I think somebody else owning the equipment. And there's a lot of those energy as a service models that are really growing out there, whereby somebody comes in, scopes the project, installs the project on the property, manages it, maintains it. The building tenants or users, they just get heat and light and air conditioning, and all the energy savings accrue to the third party owner. So that's the true off balance sheet. This is it's off balance sheet depending on whose balance sheet you look at.
Yeah, right. But it still improves project feasibility because it's assigned to the building, right? And the person with potential liability could sell that building or refinance or whatever to.
Yeah. It's just, it's, and I don't want to say PACE equity funding is perfect for every situation. There's some situations that might not be the right fit, but if there's a building owner that wants to preserve capital, like let's say they've got $1 million project that they need to do, right? It's either stuff's broken or they've got looming compliance deadlines, and it's $1 million or $2 million. I mean, I've never met a building owner that just voluntarily is like, oh, I better, let me write you a check for $2 million. Nobody ever wants to do that. They've got that $2 million tied up in something else, or they don't have the $2 million and they're going to have to borrow it. And that's where PACE equity funding is really a good solution. It can come in, fully fund a project, including fees, for a really long tenor at a fixed rate. So the building owner knows what the payments are going to be for as long as he or she has the funding. And knows what to repay, may be able to pass some of the costs on to tenants, and then has a better building, which is hopefully more efficient.
I also find that capital expense or capital budget is harder to advocate for, just because it does come in tranches. And so to say that, and you're right, it's whose balance sheet, right? So I think the operating expense, if it's, I'm just rounding numbers here, 1/20th of that number over 20 years versus all 20/20ths up front is easier to pallet. And often an operating budget is much higher than any capital budget, even a cyclical capital budget of renewal or what have you. So it's sometimes organizationally easier to add more to the operational budget than it is to a tranche or a capital budget. And so it's just more palatable, I think, to the organization as a whole.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to turn our attention here to try to make this a little bit more on the ground. So this is actually for you, David. Are there any emerging technologies or technologies you're seeing in the market right now that are starting to gain market steam, or anything you see on the horizon that are particularly compatible with CPACER, especially considering alignment with some of the IRA incentives that we're talking about, utility incentives, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope there's a lot of discussions going on right now. There should be. I think often the deeper you go with some of these technologies, like particularly ground source heat pumps, or heat pumps themselves, geothermal, and just thermal storage as a whole, I think are really wise, and they appear to have a very far horizon, like 2035, hopefully beyond. I think those are really good applications. Sometimes the site will not allow for some of that, like the ground source or geothermal, if there isn't enough adjacent mass or what have you. But you'd be surprised if you get creative. You can sometimes do that. I also think just in general, thermal storage is a smart move, relatively inexpensive, really. Where you're storing either heat and or cooling, sort of off peak or off when you would be traditionally using it. I'm attending a conference right now, and actually time of use rates are coming. I know they haven't come formally where it's an opt-out. Some are opt-in pilots right now, but thermal storage would be a really wise first choice if you have. Does require some space, obviously, for the tanks or whatever the form of storage is. There's various forms, but a small portion of a parking garage or a basement space sometimes is suffice to create that opportunity of storage.
Yeah, and just underscoring the connection to the Inflation Reduction Act there, that there's substantial investment tax credits for thermal storage. So that's
Section 48.
What's that?
Section 48.
48. 30% reduction off the top. baseline for in most cases.
In most cases.
Terry, Terry, I know that you've been working in this field for a long time, existing building decarbonization, performance standards. And so you have beyond your government role, you have a general interest in this. Do you see anything on the horizon that maybe David missed or that you would like to add?
I mean, yeah, there's countless innovative new types of projects coming out. I'll just maybe a quick shout out, a little promotion of King County. We have a new sewer heat recovery program, which hopefully folks saw a great Seattle Times article, a big new project happening in the city of Seattle. Not always a perfect fit for CPACER, but there's a lot of use cases for tapping into our sewer lines and using that heat to then power your building or to heat your building for very, very cheap. So there are a lot of things like that that are emerging, and to be honest, a lot of the times it's kind of a hassle for us to make sure that can then fit into the box of a CPACER. But we're here prepared to go to whatever depths we have to try and make these things work. So, but on your earlier overarching question on the Inflation Reduction Act, one thing that is just programmatically beneficial for us is that I think a lot of people on the call are probably familiar with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is the couple different programs, but there's $20 billion of essentially clean energy financing coming in the next year or so, and as part of that process and applications to the EPA, that a number of different applicants included a bunch of supporting and technical assistance work for CPACER programs, and things like getting small balanced CPACE projects more technical support and more standardization, so that these smaller projects and smaller buildings can benefit from this. And a lot of times, project acquisition costs are too high, or the transaction costs are too high for these things to happen at the smaller level. So we're trying to figure out all the different ways we can to leverage all these new mechanisms as they come out to get more of those projects done. So we'll wait to see who wins these big competitions for all that money, but quite a few of them included support for these projects to make sure more of them are happening.
Yeah, that's great. I love that project. Just tapping into the free heat resources flowing underground. We might as well use it, right? It's great, and it won't be the last one, I'm sure. Actually, back to you, Terry. Just thinking about, maybe thinking about those projects. What are some of the mechanisms in place to monitor and report on, account for the climate and financial aspects of project funding through CPACER, but particularly around other local, state, and federal policies? Yep.
Yeah, and I think maybe Rachel will have more details on this, as she mentioned earlier, tracking this on a project level. But just we've talked about this along the way, but CPACER is not going to always be the main driver for these projects. These big regulatory policies and BEPS, if it passes, Clean Buildings Act, these are, and sort of owners and project teams looking to reduce their emissions. That's the kind of main driver, and we're here to grease the wheels to make things more likely to happen, easier, so that more projects do happen. So that context, it's never that easy to assign specific outcomes to the program, but we do track essentially everything. So we track all the measures that are included in the project applications. We track project size, type of project. We have a process I mentioned earlier to verify the measures that they're qualified, but then also to follow up and ensure that they were installed. So we have the data to kind of track on an ongoing basis what's happening, what this is being used for, and if it's being effective. And then across the country, there's some CPACE trade organizations that do a good job of tracking overall outcomes and overall emissions, and can kind of communicate that this is a benefit at a higher level.
Yeah, it seems like it's another tool in the tool belt of addressing obviously operational emissions, and having those mechanisms in place to report up to the kind of global agencies or global tools of accounting is really helpful. So we know if we're making progress or not. I know that's an important policy goal for our state and Seattle as well. in several cities around the state. Okay, final question for everyone. So we'll just go around here. What advice would you give to a property owner or developer who's new to CPACER and considering it for an upcoming project? What advice would you give them? What's the next step they can take next week to learn more or or any other sort of global advice around that? I'll start with Rachel.
Well, I have this conversation frequently, actually. I'm out in the market, every day talking to building owners and architects and, bankers and policy to really, spread the word about CPACER and the benefits. And it's a huge part of my work plan is to raise awareness. So again, I'm very thankful for this event hosted to be able to get out some more information. The advice that I say, is it may sound new to you, but it's not new, and nobody wants to be the first one, right? Kudos to Kevin Daniels for moving really quickly on the lodge at St. Edward's Park, but my advice is let's be open-minded and just give it a try. And so, I have a very an approach is like, give me 3 pieces of information and I'll get back to you about what I think PACE equity could do for you. And if it's not the right thing, I'm certainly not going to push it. But just be open-minded and really be aware of, just the opportunity to lower your cost of capital and improve your building.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Terry, what do you think?
I think I can't find my mute button. I think the first step they should do is email cpacer@kingcounty.gov and set up time to talk. Make sure you understand the basics of what you can and can't do, how to navigate the process, how to help people understand that this is not a daunting process once you get the Rachels and the Davids and the Seths on your team and helping you through the process.
Would you mind dropping that in chat? The email?
Yep.
Yeah. cpacer@kingcounty.gov. Gotcha. Cool. David, you're last. What do you think?
Yeah, wow. Okay, I have to top both of those. I mean, yes, it is just reach out, start the discussion. Don't be trapped in internal think like can't be done. Someone told me it couldn't be done, or my predecessor couldn't do it. I think there's a lot of new avenues, and there's definitely a lot of equity that exists that wants to participate in this from a ESG and just social impact and collective and what have you. And so there's various ways, and I think first you just have to show the interest and be open. There is a way, and again, if there are fines that you are, that are looming, and you just do nothing, or business as usual, which is do nothing, then they're going to come, and it's going to be even additional regrets. So, talk to any one of us and more in this industry, and probably many of the people on the call, and let's start talking.
Well, I like what you said about equity. There's sometimes a gap between the shareholder stakeholders of especially in a larger commercial real estate situation that would absolutely support this approach, and maybe there's a disconnect between that and the folks who are actually scoping the projects, and so it's a really good point. Okay, so we are at 11:04, and we're going to open it up to audience questions. We have a great panel here, and this is your time to open up your brains and get some input from these experts on the CPACER program. So please drop your question into chat, and we don't have any yet, but
We do.
Oh, we do. Okay.
It's in a question for your side of things. Look for the questions menu bar. Do you want to read them off, Seth, or choose which ones?
Oh, I do see them now. Okay.
Oh, good. Okay.
All right. A few of these folks have left, but we'll start with Here we are. Jen asked, is seismic considered a resiliency item? And that is a yes, right, Terry? Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So that qualifies. So it looks like Eric was asking a couple questions about the first case study. Were the RTUs heat pumps that were mentioned there? And I think that was probably Rachel's case study.
Sorry, what was the question? I can't actually see the questions, so I'm going
Okay.
blank.
Yes. Well, I'll just read it off. It says, on the first case study, were the RTUs heat pumps?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. This was in Texas with a slightly less stringent code, so I don't know. I can get back to. I can find out.
Like, let me. I'm not used to go to meetings, so let me just see if I can open this up a little more. It looks like it was. Oh, it was Eric Steinberg. So yeah, we can. We can follow up with Eric. John Kennedy. Asking, could a green bank help connect projects with the appropriate lenders and capital? Terry, this sounds like a question.
Of course it could. And,
a
lot of good momentum. John and others working on establishing a green bank in Washington State. I've talked a lot with other county programs, CPACE across the state, and an overarching statewide green bank could help us all kind of move our programs along, standardize them at the state level, provide technical assistance to project teams and building owners. So absolutely.
I'll just jump in. I met with the administrator of this back east, it was Montgomery County Green Bank. They've got a county-wide, it's not a statewide. And he had some great case studies where there was CPACE, not error, CPACE came in, there was a little bit of equity, but then they were able to close the funding gap. So just a really great, some really great examples of how you need, especially in some of these really hard to reach, like Seth, you were talking about smaller buildings, folks that just don't have the staff to manage it, able to come in and really help accelerate some of those projects.
That's it sounds like it's a great question, a great seed for more discussion, hopefully soon. That's great, thank you. Thanks, John, for asking that question. Amanda Hertzfeld asks, can you speak to loan to value issues with URMs and share any recommendations?
Yeah, so we would consider seismic just at the same loan to value that we would consider any other measure. So if it were seismic alone or seismic with some other improvements, we would still want to see the value of the project under at 25 to 30% of the total value of the building, and so that's. With King County, there's no county mandated cap, but we have internal underwriting criteria that limit it to 25 or 30%. I don't know if that answered your question, Amanda.
That's great, thanks, Rachel. And if you have, and any of the other panelists, feel free to jump in if you have additional input on any of these questions, please. If you have other thoughts or follow-up questions, please put them into chat, and we'll get to them. Or if we don't quite address your question, please let us know. Next question is, are there any, I think this is referring back to our discussion around capital buy down. Are there any prepayment penalties? Or I'm sure it's different for every organization, but for your organization, Rachel?
Well, we like to call them fees.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. There are. We do have prepayment structures for every deal, and we find even though we write our funding for 25 or 30 years or whatever it may be, the average life of a PACE assessment is about 12 or 13 years. So most people are paying it off, and there's it could be a variety of reasons, interest rate change, or they do sell the property and the purchaser didn't want to keep the assessment going. So we do have prepayment structures that step down, every 5 years. We've got some that accelerate a little bit faster. And again, that's something that when I'm working with a client on a financing, we want to make sure we're understanding what their goals are so that we can tailor those appropriately.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. Next question here from the audience is BOMA active in this process? And I think maybe if I could add to that is how has BOMA been active in this process?
I've done a couple presentations. I've done a couple presentations at BOMA, so they're active in that sense of facilitating education and awareness. So that I can at least speak to that. They've done a couple different webinars just like this with stakeholders across the country, with local government implementing partners. So at least in the Puget Sound region, they've been quite active in facilitating education awareness.
Yeah, I'll second that. I've also participated in BOMA, Seattle King County events. Really, they were supportive of the legislation at the beginning, saw it as a great solution for their members. So, shout out to Rod and his team. The Seattle 2030 district has also been very pro CPACER, again, as a really good solution for their customers their members to meet both mandatory and compliance, and also just to meet the goals of the 2030 district. So shout out to them too.
Rachel. A couple more here. This is from Len Canapel. Can you provide more details on the CPACER financing for the lodge at St. Edwards Park? There's a little bit more here. I think it was 19 million. But roughly, what was the interest rate? Did they get a utility incentive, and how much was it? What were the HVAC lighting improvements? If these details are already documented in a case study, they'd like to have that if that's possible. Which it sounds like a case study, but
yeah, one of our handouts, I'll put it in the chat, does have a little bit of high-level information on the project. Again, King County is often not aware of the loan term, so we stay out of the business of tracking interest rates or publishing those or terms. So, but I mentioned on the slide a couple of the different measures. So there's a VRF heat pump system. There was some plumbing fixture, water efficiency improvements, some envelope upgrades, insulation, and then couple other smaller project fee costs covered and stuff like that. So I don't know, Rachel can probably speak to a little bit more of the details since it was before my time.
Yeah, so for folks that don't know, I was actually in Terry's role before I was recruited to join PACE Equity, and was on the county side administering this project. It was the first closing in King County. I have to admit, though, that was some time ago. I do not have the details in my mind. And as Terry said, the county sits apart from the negotiations between the lender and the borrower. So if I recall, too, there was quite a bit of press put out by this, both by King County. At that point, the county was very excited about its first deal, and Daniels Real Estate was also very proud of this deal. So there may be more information to be gathered by simply Googling it.
Len is a colleague here at City Light, so I'll let him know. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, he looks like he left. John Kennedy has another question here, another really good question. Does CPACER help overcome the split incentive? I think referring to the split incentive between owner and tenant. Terry, I'm going to throw this.
Short answer, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, part of it is, and it's interesting, it's part of it is you can pass the assessments on to the your tenants. there's other measures. I mean, interestingly enough, I was on another panel talking about, lease structures, how lease structures could be implemented in a different way to really start bridging that gap between tenant and landlord, particularly in the headlights of, a lot of voluntary compliance coming in. But yes, it's a good tool, especially as it's so long. It really does, the tenors are so long, it really does allow for those that are using the equipment to actually pay for the equipment instead of those who are there for the first 5 or 7 years to pay for the equipment for the people for the next, 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good framing. I like that. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Anything else to add there, Terry or David? There's a question here about how the IRA and CPACER work together, and we touched on it a little bit, but I think maybe this question is getting at, can you give an example of how that value stack sort of stacks up, and how that flows together? Any one of you, I'll give it to any one of you. Maybe, yeah, Rachel, you probably have the most experience on this, so maybe.
Well, I was actually thinking David's probably a little bit closer to the direct scoping of that. But I think it's in a certain extent. I mean, I've seen a lot of deals, I would say kind of on the cusp of some of this IRA funding, the little less robust. But, like we mentioned earlier, it can layer on and it can be flexible as those different incentives are coming in. I'll see if David has anything to add.
Yeah, I guess each case is unique, but I would say certainly for tax exempt commercial properties. So I'm thinking of nonprofits, houses of worship, those types of entities that don't traditionally see a lot of opportunities to find funding other than from within. I mean, the opportunity even within IRA to stack 179D and the generation or reduction credits is there to be paid directly. At least the credits to be paid directly. The 179D is a deduction, so you need some third party to accept that deduction that has a tax appetite. But couple that with the aggressive incentives that utilities are needing to post and document for either the UTC or the BPA here in Washington. And so, yeah, there's a myriad of stacking and leveraging, I guess I like to say that, $1 spent can be leveraged multiple times really to come up with a net capital cost to the client, or net operating cost in the case, I think, of CPACER.
It looks like maybe Katie is navigating us to the increased incentives offerings by City Light.
Speaking of, yes.
Did I do that okay? I don't think that was a prompt, but go for it.
So yeah, there are resources here that Katie's teed up for us to discuss around some incentives that have increased as much as 60%. These slides will be available to anyone on the call and anyone on the distribution list, so you can learn more about what's possible to again combine CPACER funding with the investment tax credits, the deductions in the Inflation Reduction Act, and again the utility incentives.
Yeah, and Rachel mentioned.
Go ahead.
Well, she mentioned the pro forma earlier, and this is where I get to have a lot of fun with how to develop that capital stack and layer it on in a very sort of measured approach or documented approach as to how the pro forma works and how quickly one might go from a negative position with cash outlay to a very quick positive position. And certainly commercial property holders, they traditionally, I think most of us here in the audience know they want this like return on investment. But the types of deep retrofits that we're talking about often, or even seismic for that matter, just don't often have a return on investment. Terry mentioned that. But you can attribute a return on investment that is pretty significant in the private commercial space.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Thanks for that extra information there. I appreciate it. The last question we have here is the King County process the same as the Seattle process? And Terry, that's a question for you, and I think it's a pretty straightforward answer.
Did you say Seattle process?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's no Seattle process. King County runs a program for the whole county. So if you're in Seattle, if you're in Bellevue, if you're in parts of Woodinville, down to Renton, contact us. And so just one program across the county. We have very similar programs as Pierce County and Snohomish County, and a few other counties across the state. So there's pretty decent standardization there if you're working in Tacoma versus Seattle. But yeah, you just contact us.
And just to clarify there, the counties run these programs, correct?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Terry dropped in a link to it looks like the article on the PR Newswire around the lodge at St. Edward's Park. Gives a little more information there. So check that out. But that was our last question. I will, we're about 10 minutes to the hour, but I'll turn for one final opportunity to the panelists to give us a potentially a question that you often hear when talking about this that maybe we didn't hear from the audience today.
I'll go first. I've talked to a lot of really progressive architects and building owners and developers who are interested in embodied carbon. Whether it's mass timber, modular, and does CPACER work with that? Well, the most CPACER policy is really focused around operational carbon, less embodied carbon. But it's a conversation up at the trade groups and the industry groups. How do we kind of catch up with the technology there? I don't want to minimize the lift because that would require changing programs at a state and county level, but it's definitely something that's in the mix. I just want to say that we at PACE Equity recognize that, and so again, those buildings that use low embodied carbon materials, that's also a pathway to qualify for the lower interest rate. So we're trying to, do incentives above and beyond the regulatory framework. But that is something that I know is of great interest to folks. Beautiful buildings, and I'd love to see more out there.
Mm-hmm. Terry or David, any things coming to mind?
Just one that I mentioned briefly, but that I get a surprising number of questions around is that public entities are not able to use CPACER. So I get quite a few questions from city partners or state partners, and just so worth clarifying that those buildings are not eligible, and smaller residential buildings as well. There was a residential PACE bill last legislative session that did not pass. So until something like that is in place, those smaller residential buildings are also not qualified. So a lot of our questions from folks just learning about the program around what does and doesn't qualify. So those are some of our biggest ones.
It's like some smart questions, people trying to become eligible. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just tag on to the public. I mean, public sector has access to money through the Office of the State Treasurer, through the local program it's called. And I believe the last set of figures were in the mid 3% in June. Now that won't exist going forward, but I mean, that's the kind of interest rate we're talking about. And those are not 20 and 30-year loans, but they are upwards of 15 years. So that's part of why we just need to explain that publics they already have a pretty good mechanism to go that way. I would say for what comes up and is that I had it. It was a good one too, and then I got thinking about Terry's answer.
Well, if it comes to you, we do get one more question here, and we can maybe it'll jog your memory. That back to seismic retrofits here. Can seismic retrofits get get the reduced rate by reducing future embodied carbon, preventing collapse post-earthquake, for example. That would increase the loan to value, or increase the value of the building. Maybe grasping at straws there, but
I appreciate the creativity.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm not sure that would work, but I appreciate the creativity. I'll talk to my leadership about that.
Yeah. And Amanda, feel free to email Rachel about that. So that was our last question. Len Campbell made a quick suggestion that a case study that shows an overview of the project goals, amount of the loan, interest rate of the loan, utility incentives, IRA funding, et cetera, just to so we can see the story of how CPACER might increase the increase the feasibility of a project. I think I've also had this desire for quite a long time. I think having a side-by-side pro forma that shows project with CPACER and without it, and kind of pulling in and out the different incentives that are possible would be really helpful. We just need somebody to fund that case study. Maybe I'll talk to you, Terry. But it's a great suggestion, Len. Thank you. But I just want to say thank you to the panelists, and thank you for the audience for your attention and great questions. I thought this was a great discussion, and I just appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to talk about this really important and effective financing tool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. David, last minute for jumping in and answering questions. I love a webinar, but I really do love a genuine discussion. 10 times better. So the second part of this was really great. Thanks for everybody for sticking around on the call, and we will see you maybe in the new year.
That's great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.